In this video, we're going to visit some ghost towns in Western Saskatchewan. Many of these places I haven't visited in almost 20 years. We're also going to visit some towns that just have some really cool abandoned buildings to shoot. We're going to see some churches, grain elevators, old shops, trucks, and more. This is the area we'll be visiting, so let's begin. Our first stop is Lake Valley, Saskatchewan. Nobody lives here anymore, and the road into town is not very good. The only building that is left is the old UGG grain elevator. The last train left here about 40 years ago, and I think this grain elevator has been closed since the 60s. You can still see the original UGG logo on the top of it. There was a church on this road, and it has been removed in the last 10 years. I even have a picture of it. I'm not sure if it was torn down or moved. Our next stop is Ernfold. There was once 300 people who lived in this town, and now only 15 remain. It's not a complete ghost town, but it's got a lot of really interesting buildings, including this church. And it's also still got the old white picket fence. And right across the street is an old Lions Club building. I don't think it's in use anymore. The Trans-Canada Highway used to pass right through town. Now it's been bypassed, and Main Street has a whole bunch of service stations and restaurants that are no longer in use. And there's also the old hockey rink. I don't think this has been used for decades. But the jewel of this town is the old school, which closed in 1972. It has now been designated a heritage site. I'm not sure what they're doing with it anymore, but they still mow the grass. And right across is the old baseball field. Our next stop is Hodgeville. This is definitely not a ghost town, but at one point it did have twice as many people. About 10 years ago, the train stopped coming here. My favorite building in this town is this old gas station. It's in my book, Forgotten Saskatchewan. I'll put a link to my book in the description below. Most of the businesses on Main Street have closed, like this old tire center. The hotel and bar is still in operation. There's the mayor. I also like this old Robin Hood flower sign. But what's really interesting about Hodgeville, it's one of the few places that have an abandoned concrete terminal grain elevator. And right behind it is this old farm thing. This looks like a very complicated machine. Our next stop is my favorite on this trip, Neidpath, Saskatchewan. The first time I visited here was in 2004, and not much has changed. It's famous for these two grain elevators, one of which has recently seen the top collapse. About 15 years ago, I met one of the last residents. He'd lived here all his life. He remembers as a child climbing up one of those grain elevators. It used to be a pretty big town with a couple hotels. Now almost all of it is gone. And if you walk up the road a little bit, you can check out this really neat old church. The front is kind of collapsing now. There's no way you can get inside. But let's go check it out. And out behind the church is this old car. It's been photographed hundreds and hundreds of times now. It's also a nice little town. It's in this valley and it's really peaceful. I'm here today to actually shoot more pictures for my next book, Forgotten Saskatchewan 2. There's a little bit of the old fence. Now I'm pretty sure this old house was used for the teacher. I can't confirm this as I remember this story from 15 years ago. But at the end of this road, I believe is where the school was located. I'm not going to go inside these buildings because they are on private property and somebody does own them. When you're traveling in rural Saskatchewan, there's a lot of intersections where nobody has a yield or a stop sign. So make sure you look both ways at every intersection. Our next town is Fosterton, Saskatchewan. Nobody lives here anymore, but it's really famous for the St. John's Lutheran Church built in 1919. It's still used for events like weddings and stuff. And just down the road is the house where the staff used to live. It's on private property, so I'm only going to walk this far. And just east of the town is the old one-room school. It was in use until 1960. The train tracks were torn up about 24 years ago. And this is all that's left on Main Street. And while I was here, I was hit by a dust tornado. That was really interesting. Our next stop is Abbey, Saskatchewan. This is definitely not a ghost town. In fact, it's one of those small towns that are really friendly and nice that I would actually move here. Someone told me this might have been the old school. Someone has painted it really nice. But what I really like about this town is the old fire hall. I'm not sure what they use it for now, but it's really nice. And of course, the town still has the grain elevator. And along Main Street, you're going to see a whole bunch of abandoned businesses. At one point, I think I ate in this cafe about 20 years ago. Our next town is Portreeve, Saskatchewan. There's only a population of 5 people here. But it does appear this place had probably a couple hundred people at one point. Main Street is pretty much empty except for one store. I'm not sure what business this used to be, but it's been boarded up for a long time. And right across the street is the old community hall. When you're driving down all the roads, every once in a while you're going to see an old abandoned house. But my favorite building is the old hockey rink. It has completely collapsed now. The train still services this town, and it does have a grain elevator that I believe is still in use. The next town is Mendham, Saskatchewan. There's still quite a number of people who live here, but not as many as before. And its claim to fame is that this is where Steve Fossett landed in 1995. He was the guy who flew a hot air balloon around the world. My first visit here was 20 years ago. It still had a couple grain elevators that were torn down in 2009. And at one point there was a store here. I remember going in here trying to buy some food. And there's the straight and narrow. Just east of town, right along the highway, there's this really neat museum where you can actually go inside the buildings, including this small church. These are open to the public, but please make sure you close the doors when you leave. And of course, treat these buildings with respect. Here's an old one-room school. I'm very happy that people in the area have taken the time to preserve these buildings and allow the public to come in and view them. And the last building is an old homestead, and it's been set up in a way so you can see what it was like living in the past. It must have been a very lonely existence. And about another 5 or 6 kilometers east of here is the amazing church. I've been shooting here for years. In fact, there's a picture of this church with the auroras in my book, Forgotten Saskatchewan. And once again, I'll put a link to that book in the description below. Our next stop is going to be Eatonia, Saskatchewan. This is far from a ghost town. It's actually a really pretty town with lots of services. But it also has a couple neat buildings like this grain elevator with the original wheat pool logo. This car has been sitting for sale for quite a long time. And there's an old abandoned tailor and dry cleaner. My favorite building here is probably this old abandoned Imperial gas station. I think it's still used for storage, but it hasn't been in use for decades. And this community has an amazing museum. It's only open during the summer, but all year long you can go check out the caboose. And they even took the time to import this old homestead and restore it. I've been inside of it. It's amazing. And the train station. The train still passes through town, so be careful here. And just down the road is the ghost town of Mantario, Saskatchewan. Main Street is pretty much empty now. There is a post office box. This old gas station stopped running about the year 2000. I think someone still uses it for storage. And you can see the old sidewalk, so I'm going to walk down here and check out these buildings. This looks like it was just a garage of some sort. And there's this old house. Even though this town still has train tracks, the train does not service it anymore. I don't think the train has passed through here in decades. Our next stop is Alsask, Saskatchewan. This is definitely not a ghost town, but it's got a lot less residents than it used to have. My favorite building is this old school. And just north of town is an abandoned military base. There's still lots of buildings here, but most of them are privately owned. You can still see the road where the base used to have a whole bunch of houses. This is now private property. There's buildings like this scattered throughout the base. And I even came across an old abandoned golf course. And here's the old church. At one point, they tried to turn this into a retirement villa. I don't think that worked out too well. You can spend about an hour or two exploring most of these buildings. There is a pool and a recreation center that the town has taken over. Our next stop is Loverna, Saskatchewan. I first visited here 20 years ago. A few of the buildings are gone now. Here's an old hall. The train stopped coming here in the 80s and the town fell apart pretty quickly. There's still a handful of residents here. And here's one of the old churches in town. This town is located right along the Alberta border, but we're still in Saskatchewan. And here's some of the old buildings on Main Street. That was a Chinese laundry. When you're exploring towns like this or any place that's abandoned in Saskatchewan, just have respect for the landowners. Most landowners don't mind people stopping by taking pictures. They just don't want people crawling throughout their property and going inside of the buildings. There's also a couple of old abandoned houses in town. Still has the Christmas lights on it. You'll really enjoy walking through these old ghost towns, trying to imagine what life was like about 60, 70 years ago. The social network in those days were sports, churches, and community events. Our next town is Hoosier, Saskatchewan. When I was here 15 years ago, I don't think this co-op hardware store was here. But my favorite building in this town is this old school. It closed down in the 80s, as well as the grain elevator. And the train stopped coming here in the 80s as well. And on the other side of town is this wonderful old classic church. Our next stop is Superb, Saskatchewan. The only reason why I come here is because of this grain elevator with the old classic Saskatchewan wheat pool logo on it. There's not very many of them left. As you can see from the road in the town, there is no other buildings. There is, however, a house on the edge of town with a bunch of old vehicles up front. Our next stop is Ruthilda, Saskatchewan. Population 5, but at one point it had over 100 residents. My favorite building is this old United Church. It was built in 1928 and had services until 2005. In the 80s, when the train stopped coming here and the grain elevators closed, the population declined really fast. And you can still see some abandoned houses walking down Main Street. And here's the old baseball diamond. I don't think they use it anymore. They do still have the old garage in town. Doesn't look like it's been in use for a long time. I do believe that hotel is now a private residence. In 1962, the town passed a law allowing women to go into the bar. And on the edge of town, there's this building with an old Coca-Cola sign on it. It used to be a pool hall and I think a cafe. Now we'll head to Stranraer, and I'm pretty sure I mispronounced that. Very sorry. My favorite building in this town is this old school. It was closed down in 1969. The population had declined. And would you believe there used to be a ski hill in the area? It closed down in 2009. There is train tracks going by town, but it hasn't been used in more than a decade. And the church in town is amazing. The birds here made the scene kind of eerie. And here's the old sidewalk where the residences used to be. There's a couple of abandoned houses here still. No smoking sign. Now we'll head over to Herschel, Saskatchewan. It's nearby. There's still a lot of people who live here. I was here in 2005 when it still had 2 grain elevators and the train happened to be in town to pick up the next load. The grain elevators are now gone and the train no longer comes. Right along Main Street, you're going to see a bunch of relics from the past. This town is in a really pretty valley. The old church is now the museum. And they even have an old threshing machine. It kind of looks like a metal dinosaur. I don't know what this building used to be, but it looks like it's an RM office now. And one of my favorite buildings in all of Saskatchewan, the Herschel Cafe. I have a picture of this cafe in my book. I'm going to take another one. Next town is Netherhill, Saskatchewan. This is not a ghost town. There's only one building to check out, and it's the old school. But because it is so cool, you got to come here and see this. The photo on my book I shot in fall when there was no green grass, and it looks kind of eerie. Now we're going to head over to Snipe Lake. This is a complete ghost town. Nobody lives here anymore. It's the kind of town you're really going to enjoy just walking down the main road. It looks like this foundation used to be where a house was. And here's one of the abandoned houses. I don't think this town was ever very big. But it did have grain elevators, but they've been gone for a long time. And here's the old greenhouse. My favorite time for shooting buildings like this is in fall or early spring. When the trees are bare and the colors are gone, it just seems to make really nice photos of abandoned buildings. Our next town is Richley, Saskatchewan. I don't think anybody lives here anymore. But it's got 2 really cool grain elevators, and if you go a couple blocks over, there's 2 old vintage cars parked so you can shoot the grain elevators with some foreground. I really like this one. Not much else is on Main Street except a couple houses. There's not much else here except for a few abandoned houses. Now we're going to head to Eatonia, Saskatchewan. I visited here 15 years ago when the train was still in service. I really like this old grain elevator. I don't think it's in use anymore. But here's Main Street. They still have the sidewalk, but there's almost no buildings left. But this old church is worth coming here alone. I really like this building. I'm going to shoot it for my next book. It's not in use anymore, and someone told me they have discussed moving it. I'm not sure what that building is, but it looks like it might still be in use. And here's the old garage and store. Somehow it has survived all of these years. Now we'll head to Bounty. Now we're going to head to Bounty, Saskatchewan. In 2008, me and a whole bunch of friends visited this town to do a ghost town convention. There was still a few residents left. We talked to a few. Now it appears nobody lives here at all. This is the kind of ghost town that's really fun and enjoyable to walk around. Everything is marked no trespassing, so please respect the landowner's wishes. I really enjoy visiting this place. It's really peaceful and quiet. I think there's got to be at least 6 abandoned houses here now. And at the end of Main Street, there's this old church. At some point in the last 10 years, somebody moved the old theater that was here into the next town over at Outlook. And this, I believe, was an old school. It's kind of sad to see that nobody's here anymore. The next town over is Conquest, Saskatchewan. It's definitely not a ghost town. But one of the reasons why I like to visit this town is for the orange Pioneer grain elevators. I don't think there's very many left anymore. And there's this old gas station and car dealership. I really like this building. I'm not sure when it closed down, but it was also a Tempo gas station. And as a bonus today, there was this old grain truck. And once you get into downtown, the Merchant Hotel is really neat. You're going to enjoy shooting this building. It also was a Greyhound bus station. Next, we're going to head to feudal Saskatchewan. There's no residents left here, and I don't think it was much more than a whistle stop. It does have this really nice grain elevator, a Saskatchewan wheat pool. It's deteriorated a lot in the past few years. I have a picture of this grain elevator on the front cover of my grain elevator photo book. I'll put a link to it in a description below. Across the street there's this building. I have no idea what it is. And that was probably the residence for the grain elevator agent. It doesn't look like there's ever more than 5 or 6 houses here. And here's the foundation for one of them. But it doesn't look like there's a basement, so maybe it was a store. And it looks like this was a pretty small house. And now we'll head over to Western Saskatchewan. It's another one of those ghost towns with no residents. I really hope you're enjoying these videos. I love visiting ghost towns. One of these days I'm going to make a ghost town video where I'll try to find images from the past and show you what it looks like now. The grain elevator burnt down just a few years ago. Otherwise, there's just a couple of old abandoned houses here. But you can make out the old streets that used to be busy. I'd estimate there's probably 100 people who lived here at one time. But with rail lines being shut down and grain elevators closing, a lot of these little towns had no chance. And this was one of them. If you do have any questions or comments, please leave it in the comment section below. If you have any tips about any of these buildings being torn down, put it in the comment section below and I'll update it in the description. I really hope you enjoyed this trip across Western Saskatchewan. I do have other ghost town videos on my channel that you can check out, and I will be adding more. Okay, thanks everyone. Goodbye.